champion today. I'm friends with Melanie Moon, and we're working on going through the Race in the City book. And so today we will be discussing chapter 2 about John Mercer Langston and the Cincinnati Riot of 1841. So first off, there's too much to cover in this short synopsis, but I am going to bring out some highlights that stood out to me, as well as break it up into 3 easy sections. So first we're going to talk about Cincinnati, because it's way different back then than it was now, or than it is now. And then I'm going to talk about John Mercer Langston, who he is and why he's important. And then 3, we're going to talk about the actual riot of 1841. So briefly, Cincinnati was a growing city at the time of the 1841 riot. Growing in the span of 1800 to 1840, it grew from a frontier outpost on the edge of the west of the known United States at the time to the 6th largest city in the U.S. So I think of this expansion, the term Queen City of the West, Emporium of the West. We get the idea that westward expansion from the coast to Ohio should probably be considered in a similar manner to westward expansion that we think of as Western today. This idea of hope and getting yourself a plot of land and getting a chance to start over, or a chance to come to Cincinnati and find work and really enjoy the benefits of being successful. It's the American dream that you see allowing growth in Cincinnati, just exponential growth. Now, let's talk about briefly, that's just a quick little picture. There's a lot you could talk about in there. You don't have suburbs in Cincinnati yet. That comes much later. You have a lot of people packed into a small space. You have poor people that have just arrived maybe, or are still impoverished, or you have rich people who have succeeded and made it that are there in Cincinnati. One of the quotes was, "Yesterday's raisin cake vendor, tomorrow's congressman." So you have this idea of quick success that could happen to anybody. So very exciting, ambitious time to be in a young Cincinnati, a young city that is growing. Residential areas, though, think about it. You've got tons of people stuffed into small areas. You have shanty towns. They talked specifically about what we call over the Rhine now. It used to be called Germany. They had a section that was near there that was called Bucktown because of all the African Americans living there. And then you had a place called the Bottoms. The Bottoms was a place where all the refuse from the pork places, so think slaughterhouses, all the blood and pig guts and everything coming down through the Bottoms to get to the river. People lived there. People lived in these tiny shacks that were 12 foot by 8 foot, for example, and had as many as 6 people crammed into this one little room. Not good conditions. So there's a lot you could talk about with Cincinnati, but you can't picture the city that we have today. Now contrast that with the successful parts of town. You had paved streets, you had beautiful houses. So both of these were coexisting in relatively close proximity to each other. So the city was one of contradictions and growth and exciting ambition, as well as not so good, people not making it as well yet. Now let's get to the black community. What did it look like to be part of the black community? That is detailed, oh my gosh, in this chapter so much. So the Ohio black laws we should talk about first. It blows my mind. Black people were not allowed to testify in court. They're prevented from that. They are not permitted to attend public school because Cincinnati, being as successful as it has been, has set up public schools to help children who can't afford to go to a private school. So it's it's developed the system to provide education for the poor, but left black people out on purpose. Then there's the bonding, the law that requires any black person in Cincinnati, freed black person, in order to be in Cincinnati, you have to pay a $500 bond in order to live there. It's just crazy. Like, I can't imagine. So you have very restrictive measures put on black Cincinnatians. On top of that, you also had the prejudice and the violence that recurred quite frequently. If you think about it, you just had a riot in 1829, and that almost eradicated the black population, because eradicated maybe the wrong word, because there was violence, but most of the black people felt like Cincinnati couldn't be a home to them anymore and left. And there's a whole conversation about a town in Canada that started from those black refugees, and called Wilberforce. So that's not in this chapter, but that's part of this. 1829 riot. 1836 there was another riot, and you just have so many setbacks. Yet the black community is succeeding, is thriving in spite of these things. The thing that stood out to me, though, before I even get to that, if you were black in Cincinnati and you were working your butt off just to survive, most black Cincinnatians were not employed just with feeding their family and feeding themselves and just trying to succeed. They were trying to purchase family members from slavery. So it goes into detail in this chapter about how many dollars they guessed at, so many people had bought themselves from slavery, and so many people were working to purchase others from slavery. It gave the story of William W. Watson and how he was begging with people. He was on an auction block. He was a slave at the age of 24, begging on an auction block for people not to buy his wife and child, so that his brother-in-law, who had borrowed money in Cincinnati as a Cincinnati barber, had borrowed money and was going to buy him and his family and bring them to freedom. So you just have this picture of the desperation as well as the determination and to see people freed, to buy family members out of slavery. That's not something I can even conceive of, but that is the reality for black Cincinnatians. And primarily, how they build a community is this drive to purchase people out of slavery, this drive to build the community. Phenomenal. William Watson goes from being a slave to owning hundreds, it said something like 500 acres in Mercer County, to support black farmers, and then also started owning property, owning businesses, owning barbershops, and really building enough wealth and support in the community. He became such a leader, and even was instrumental and instructive to Langston. Talk about Henry Boyd. You talk about how he invented a mattress, and then had this mattress, or had this furniture company that succeeded incredibly well, in spite of the fact that his factory kept getting burned down. It kept getting burned down so much, the insurance company said, forget it, we're not insuring you anymore. And he had to close the factory down because he couldn't get insurance on it, and it kept getting burned down. So moving on quickly, though. So you get a picture of Cincinnati, you get a picture of what black life was in Cincinnati. I must mention one other thing about the fugitive slaves, how when fugitive slaves were in Cincinnati, because of fugitive slave laws, masters were allowed to come into the North to seek out their slaves and to bring them back. This resulted in a lot of bad things. First off, there were a lot of hunts for slaves. So Cincinnati, you might hear, oh my gosh, so and so is looking for their runaway slave in Cincinnati. Not only would you hear about it, but a lot of white people would jump in and join in on the hunt, and it would become a mob thing, and the police would often get involved to help this slave owner capture their fugitive slave. And this often, though, was misused in such a way that somebody might be claimed, who was a freed person, might be claimed as a slave, and it would be hard to prove. And just horrible situations going on where somebody might technically be free, but in the eyes of the law, they were a fugitive. And that comes out later in the run-up to the Cincinnati riot with a woman who had been free and living in Cincinnati for 10 years. And it comes, a slave owner from Kentucky claims her as a fugitive slave. And it becomes a whole court case that in the run-up. It actually is decided in her favor because of Salmon P. Chase, who argues that it might have been on a technicality, I wasn't sure how it read exactly, but that she could not be a fugitive slave and was indeed a free woman. And the judge of that case, Nathaniel C. Reed, said that in Ohio, or in Cincinnati, I don't know if it was, I think in Ohio, involuntary servitude should be the exception, not the law. So this particular judge was seen as having abolitionist leanings in deciding that slavery should be the exception, not the rule, in Ohio. This angered a lot of people, and when with the riot of 1841, you found the Inquirer, the Cincinnati Inquirer that we all know and love, being the newspaper that really stoked the fears and would take, respond to that case with a lot of hatred towards abolitionism, and also fear of Southern interests leaving Cincinnati because Cincinnati would not protect the property of slaveholders. So that was very instrumental in 1840. What else stood out to me? I will switch now and talk about John Mercer Langston. Phenomenal historical figure. You got to know. Now, don't get him confused with Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is a descendant. John Mercer Langston is the original, you could call him. He was born in unbelievable lineage. Like, what a lineage to say that you are, that, not you, him, he was born to a white slave holder, his father. His mother was a freed slave who was also half Native American. So John Mercer Langston has 3 histories tied together in his person just by blood. But to go on from that, talking about how he was orphaned at 4 years old, how he was raised by a white family, and then at 8 years old, his white family moves to a slave state, leaving him behind. So he goes through 2 different orphanings, and he expressed it in just one sentence in this chapter, how much anger and rage at being abandoned, how he must have felt in these 2 separate instances. His white family, he actually educated him and gave him their last name. So he was called Johnny Gooch when he was with the Gooches in Chillicothe. But when he came to Cincinnati, he went from a white family, maybe thinking he was white. I'm not sure to what degree he did or didn't, but in Cincinnati, being in a very race-conscious city and being identified as black. You can see him when in this chapter, it describes him running through the streets and hears a policeman yell after him, and he is identified by the police as black. And, these are very stark moments for a young boy who has gone through so many different transitions so quickly. In Cincinnati, he is educated at a black school, which is in the basement of a black church. He attends the black church. He meets William Watson and others, and is so instrumental. During the riot happens. You have Kentuckians coming into Cincinnati. You have a mob forming, and the black community actually mounts a resistance to it. They organize, and it's just incredible to see. And that informs John Mercer Langston's actions later on. You can only imagine what it was for him to see the black community not only constructing a community and building a community, but responding to a threat and to actually successfully defend themselves in spite of how the white community reacted later in taking all the guns away and in imposing even stricter restrictions on the black community, and really punishing them for being able to defend themselves. But you see how these events inform John Mercer Langston so that when he goes on, becomes the first black lawyer in Ohio, becomes the first black elected official, becomes a recruiter during the Civil War. He helps to recruit the first black regiments, 2 in Massachusetts, and then actually leads recruitment for the first black regiment in Ohio. And then even so forth from there, when he's in Virginia later, he becomes the first African-American congressman for Virginia, and was the only African-American congressman from Virginia for over 100 years. So it's just astonishing to see what John Mercer Langston would go on to do with the life that he had, and how much of that came from experiencing the black community in Cincinnati and using the events of the riot of 1841 and the response to it as instructive to what black people could accomplish, and how they could organize and resist oppression. So just astonishing. I think that's about it. There's plenty of things we can get into. I got this feel when reading this chapter that when they were in hiding during the riot and the police were arresting the black men, and Johnny is running through the streets to go warn his brother, and he gets there and he finds them in hiding. He faints, and a shopkeeper gets him to his brother. But you get this real sense that it's almost like closest thing that I can think of would be World War II and the hiding Jews from the Nazis. That kind of underground kind of feel is present, and you have Gideon Langston and others in that circle and William Watson and others being significant in connections to the Underground Railroad. So you almost have this black community having a respectable side and also having a desperate underground, we're helping people escape to freedom side. That it coincides almost like spies along with respectable businessmen, and it's fascinating to see all this take place in this one moment. So once again, just a phenomenal chapter, and I'm happy to have learned so much from it, and I hope you have too. Hello, my name is Ryan Spence, and I will be your chapter